Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story is about a girl who transformed into a love story, and the mother of one 11-year-old little villain decided to give it as a birthday present. The girl believed that it would not matter at all what role she would play, but she still did not understand how she could end up in the novel in the role of a squirrel. She was irritated by all of this, and she realized that the thing that made her situation even worse was the fact that she was now in a prison cell. It was the worst transformation that could possibly happen. The girl did not understand at all how this happened. However, in the blink of an eye, she was transformed into a squirrel, and with a grandiose name, was called a divine beast. She found herself in a new world, in the estate of the Duke of Highland, one fine day. The Highlands were a renowned magical family that controlled the most powerful and skilled magicians of their generation. However, their power also had its price in society. The stronger the magician, the more difficult it is to contain his overwhelming magic, thus causing great suffering to the person. The only creature that could calm this raging magic inside a person was precisely the divine beast. And this need for a divine beast means that the person who has powers has an incredibly large amount of magic, so this creature is necessary for him. And since the Duchess of Highland named Ella was famous, she wanted to show absolutely everyone that her son's boundless magic was enough to demand a divine beast. Although his magic is not so remarkable, it would hardly be enough to draw water from a shallow well, in the opinion of the squirrel itself. As soon as the boy was given this squirrel for his birthday, he opened the cage and said that he wanted to take it. Mother was not against it at all. She even told him to take care of this animal in his room. This guy's name was Tenzin. Ella also said that she had already engraved the seal of ownership on the animal so that it would not be able to escape from the Duke's estate. At that moment, the squirrel began to understand perfectly well that she was in a real trap. Ella picked her up in her arms in order to pass her directly to her son. Mother turned to Tenzin and told him to look at her, and also asked if it was true that this animal understood human language perfectly well. As soon as the girl who had transformed into a squirrel heard this, she decided that she did not want to completely panic, so she decided to play the role of a noble gift giver just this once. The boy at that moment began to watch the animal with great contempt. She did not understand why he looked at her like that, because she did not seem to cause any reason for suspicion. But at that moment, Tenzin suddenly grimaced and asked if it was true that it was very creepy, because animals should not understand human speech. But this one simply obeyed, as if it knew it perfectly. When the squirrel heard this, she was so surprised that she couldn't believe that he decided to say it out loud at all. She even assumed that he was just making fun of her. But Ella at that moment handed the animal into his hands and said that this was not so, and that it was not just an animal at all, but a divine beast, so that he would know this and always remember. She also said that besides all this, according to legend, divine beasts that absorb a lot of magic can even turn into humans over time. When the son heard about this, he immediately thought seriously about it. He hadn't really heard about it before, but it interested him very much. Tenzin then cleared his throat and said that he believed that with his magic, it wouldn't take him long to achieve humanity. However, if this animal became human and couldn't understand speech, it would be quite problematic. He looked the animal straight in the eyes and wondered if she could really become human over time. That was what attracted him most about the gift. Tenzin raised his head and looked at his mother, wondering if it was true that he would eventually have another slave to command. When the squirrel heard that he considered her a slave, she was outraged. She did not understand how his brain could even come to such a decision when they were talking about her becoming a human. And besides, it was generally impossible to transform into a human using magic, especially considering the amount of his magic. At that moment, she really wanted to hit this narcissistic boy on the head, but her short pause betrayed her. So that was the sadness of the life of such a beast. Even though it was her first day, she was already irritated by the very fact that she would have to see this hopeless boy every day. But still, the fact remained that this Highland estate could serve her purpose. And all because in the highest room of the western tower of the Duke's mansion lies the true villain of this novel and the most powerful wizard of their entire powerful family. It was a magician who was a really unusual person, and that's why the squirrel really wanted to meet him. And she believed that if this man was really as powerful as they said, then the process of turning into a human might not just be her dream. However, at that moment, their conversation was suddenly interrupted by a knock on the door. From there, someone's voice was heard, who, addressing Madame, said that someone had come out of the tower. Ella, hearing about this, was very surprised. She immediately went to the door and, opening it, saw the butler, then asked if something had happened. The man replied that the young master had fallen ill with a severe fever, just like last time. When the squirrel heard this, she was a little surprised. She thought that if it was the young master in the tower, then it meant that he was the man who was the most powerful magician. Ella, at this point, covered herself with her fan so that no one could see her expression, and asked in surprise if this had really happened again. And then, looking him straight in the eyes, she asked him if it was true that he was not dead, because it was quite possible. As soon as the squirrel heard that he could die, she simply froze in place in surprise, because it never occurred to her that everything could be so serious. And then the butler replied that, actually no, everything was fine. He had just temporarily lost consciousness. His life was not in danger. Ella replied that it was a great relief for her. And the boy, who at that moment continued to hold the animal in his arms, sat her down next to the cage and said that his arms were already tired of holding her. Ella, at this point, said that they should give him a good rest and make sure that no food was prepared for him that day. The man bowed and said that he would make sure to see to all of this, and then left to carry out her order. At this point, Mother approached Tenzin and said that she had to leave. He, meanwhile, said that there was no problem and wished her a safe journey. As soon as the squirrel heard all this, she was very surprised. She knew that this was her adopted son, but she still did not understand how one could react like that when the child fainted due to his health condition. So the girl came to the conclusion that this woman really was just a heartless person. She also concluded that such fainting spells were not at all uncommon for him, since she reacted absolutely calmly. However, the girl also concluded that his condition could ultimately be even worse than she had assumed. Meanwhile, she hopped to her plate with many varieties of nuts. She decided to feed herself, because she understood that she would not be able to find the truth in this story yet. So she decided to put off these thoughts for later. When Ella left, the guy sat down at the table and began to watch his new animal closely. He addressed her, calling her a slave. And after that, he asked why she didn't put on a little show for him, because he was very bored and would like to have a little fun. When the squirrel heard this, she was very indignant. She did not understand what he thought he was and why he called her that. Meanwhile, seeing zero reaction from her, he asked if this meant that she did not understand what he was saying to her, since she did not even turn around. Then he suggested that perhaps he should train her or something in that case so that she would listen to him in the future. At this point, the squirrel began to watch him yell at the servants and thought that this ill-mannered boy would mock her because she had already managed to observe how he treated everyone else. She knew that in this case, she should avoid contact with him until it got worse, so curled up into a ball, she simply lay on her soft pillow, even stopping to eat. This made Tenzin very angry, and he touched her soft fur, asking if she could hear him, and also why she was sleeping. When she still showed no reaction, he sighed heavily and said that he was starting to get tired of all this. He also said that he thinks it's just an animal that only knows how to eat and sleep, so he doesn't think there's anything special about it, like his mother told him. The girl, meanwhile, continued to ignore him, and thought that she was actually a human in her past life, so she definitely wouldn't have fallen for these provocations. So, knowing the sensations she had while in the human body, she was going to reincarnate into it again. Several hours had passed since then, and the girl actually even managed to sleep a little. But when it got dark outside, she decided it was time to stretch a little. When she looked back, she saw that her new master had already fallen asleep. So she wished him a safe journey to the world of dreams. Of course, she found him very disgusting, so it was not from the bottom of her heart and soul. The girl also decided to take a small snack with you because she knew that the road would not be short, and therefore she would definitely get hungry. Of course, she had to put in a lot of effort to secure this nut to her back, but she still managed to do it and went outside. She ran with all her might along various inclinations and eventually reached the place where she was going, namely the tower, in which the main villain of this story was located. When the girl looked through the window, she immediately saw the poor guy, who felt terrible, and because of this did not even sleep, despite the fact that it was quite a late hour. He was simply writhing in pain. His whole body was twisting. The guy was even ready to burst into tears, but he still held it in. But when he turned his attention to the window, he suddenly noticed that there was someone there. Looking more closely, he noticed that it was a squirrel. Meanwhile, the girl, breathing in joyfully, waved her hand at him in greeting. The guy, through his pain, went to the window and, opening it, asked what the squirrel was doing on such a high floor, and waving at him. But at that moment she continued to knock on the glass, and the guy did not open the window all the way for some time. When he saw this, he was very surprised, because he assumed that she was trying to ask him to open the window. But he had never seen a squirrel do this before. But soon, when this knocking did not stop, he asked her to wait a little and move away. At the same moment, he opened the window completely so that she could go inside. However, the squirrel accidentally moved so far that she could not hold on. And moreover, due to the large excess weight behind her in the form of a nut, she began to fall from a huge floor down. She immediately became incredibly scared, because she had not even mastered elementary magic, let alone turning into a human. So she understood that if she simply fell, she would crash to her death. So she really wanted this guy to save her. And this boy actually managed to react in time. He opened the window all the way, and in the last seconds managed to reach out and grab her small body. He immediately asked her for forgiveness and asked if everything was okay with her, because he was really very afraid for her health. But there was only fear in her eyes. The squirrel was even ready to cry. Her whole body was shaking due to strong nerves, but she was glad that she was still alive. But then suddenly, she felt some strange sensation around her, and even assumed that it was most likely Johan's magic. When the boy put her back on the windowsill, he asked if she was hurt anywhere. And the girl at that moment was thinking only about the fact that even after a very short touch, she felt the enormous power that emanated from him. She understood that his magic was so strong that it was the reason he was suffering so much. All the pain in his body was because there was too much of this magic, and he simply couldn't control it. She wanted to help him as soon as possible, so she immediately touched the tip of his nose with her little paw, and at that moment, the guy finally felt relief. The boy felt that his magic had stabilized, and finally, peace appeared in his soul. He no longer felt the deafening pain that he had felt before the touch of this animal. After some time, he turned to this squirrel and did not even ask whether his assumption was correct. He stated the fact that she was a divine animal. She, of course, did not answer him, but only nodded her head in agreement. He came closer to her and said that judging by the hater sign on her stomach, she belonged to the Tezen Club. So he asked, "Why did you come all this way to me?" But the girl couldn't, of course, speak human language. So she said something, but it just sounded like the sound of a squirrel. The guy laughed nervously and said that she, of course, couldn't speak human language. So he asked her for forgiveness for not thinking of it right away. The girl at that moment thought that most likely he was behaving this way because he was still young. After all, for a villain, he seemed completely kind and even polite. In fact, the greatest villain in this novel, Johan Heiress, stood before her. However, he looked completely different from what he should have looked like, despite his future title. When Johan was still a child, his mother, who was a former duchess, died to his great regret. The Duke of Highland remarried Elsa, bringing Thesan into the family. And soon after this, the Duke was called to war, so the boy was left alone with Elsa, who was now also his guardian. He ended up leaving Johan as a man who would still be at that age where he was incredibly in need of love. And to make matters worse, at the age of 10, his magic awakened, which caused him to suffer unbearable pain from constant magical surges, as his powers were incredibly strong. Elsa, who really wanted her son Tezen to become the heir, found this situation very inconvenient for herself. She ended up pretending that Johan was sick and locked him in a tower so that no one would see him again. And in the end, living in constant agony and isolation from everyone, Johan was eventually sent to the battlefield as part of Elsa's plan. And so, 5 years later, Johan returned home with the UMF as a war hero who had ended a long and brutal battle. However, along with this guy, the tragedy that began long before also returned. The most beautiful noblewoman of the empire, Lady Marielle, was presented as a reward to Johan, who became a war hero. Johan falls in love with Marielle at first sight and desperately longs for her love in return. However, her heart already belonged to the crown prince, and he could not win her over. As a result, driven by jealousy, Johan becomes a villain who stops at nothing. Using any means necessary to tear them apart, he stopped at nothing and was even willing to hurt those close to him. Therefore, now that the squirrel was opposite him, she did not understand how this sweet and kind boy could have become the main villain of the whole story, who had done so much trouble and evil. It was hard for her to believe all this. But then, suddenly, while the girl was thinking, he reached out his hands to her and said that it was so nice for him when he touched her. All the pain that was stored inside him evaporated somewhere. So, feeling a little shy, he asked her if she would mind if he stroked her for a while longer, because he wanted to check if it would feel good for him as well. It was really hard for her to believe that he could become a villain, because unlike even some people, and by these people she meant her new master, he was an incredibly sweet boy and even asked her permission. So when she shook her head, he wondered if she really let him. And then he thanked her and started petting her. He really felt even better. All the pain went away when he stroked this squirrel. Then he decided to talk to her, said that he had been alone in this place for a very long time, and he thought that this was the first time that someone had decided to stay with him for so long when he was in pain. So of course, he felt incredibly pleased about it. Eventually, the night began to give way to dawn, and the squirrel continued to stay with him. He explained that a little earlier, he had been in incredible pain and very lonely. He even thought about how good it would be if he had never been born at all, or if he could have been born as someone ordinary, without magical abilities that caused him so much pain. However, then he looked at her, and with a smile on his face said that it was before she came to him. Now he feels completely different. Continuing to pet the squirrel, he thanked her for doing this, because for the first time he did not experience either the pain or the loneliness that had haunted him all his life. He continued to thank her and gave the girl a joyful smile. She almost fainted from this, because knowing that he was a villain, she could hardly believe that he was capable of such kind words. When she looked at his face, she suddenly felt some kind of protective instinct inside her that she couldn't explain at all. She only planned to quickly absorb magic from him so that the boy wouldn't feel so bad, and turning into a human was all she thought about when she came to him. But now it was more than that. After a short silence, Johan, a little shyly, asked if she could also come to him again tomorrow, because he would be very grateful to her. He also said that she doesn't even need to calm him down. He just wants to pet her, and that's it. Or even just the fact that she comes in is enough for him. At the very least, she keeps him company this way, and he is no longer alone. As soon as the squirrel heard this, she immediately became happy. Of course, she planned to come, so she would definitely visit him every day to help him with these pains. So, in agreement, she quickly shook her head. Johan, seeing this, immediately smiled and thanked her for it, saying that he appreciated her help. The girl herself smiled at that moment, and thought that during this short time, she felt softness and compassion from this boy. So this image did not correspond at all to the image of a villain. She suggested that Johan most likely became someone who could not hesitate to hurt others, because he had endured so much pain and loneliness for so long that he simply could not stand it. However, if at least one person showed him love and care, the girl believed that the future associated with his role as a villain could change. You see, now he was not alone, and these obsessive thoughts could at least briefly leave his sweet head. Of course, she didn't know how much she could help him while in the squirrel's body, but while she was there, she would do absolutely everything she could. That is why she decided to give him the nut that she took for a snack. And handing it to the boy, she thought that she would protect his pure and fragile soul. As soon as he saw this nut, he immediately asked if she really wanted to give it to him, and the squirrel nodded her head in agreement. Without thinking twice, he held out his arms so that she could sit in them, and then pulled the squirrel towards him, touching his nose to her body, and thanked her, saying that he would definitely take care of him. She stayed there for a while longer, but then she realized that it was time for her to leave, and as he was seeing her off, Johan said that starting tomorrow evening he would leave the window open especially for her. Therefore, he added that in this case she could come to him whenever she wanted, and he would look forward to their meeting again. She immediately smiled and waved her little paw at him goodbye, thinking that he was an incredibly cute creature, and also that she would definitely come to him tomorrow. After that, she carefully jumped down and ran back towards her room, while Johan watched her, leaning out of the window a little. After that, he remained standing there for a while, thinking about how recently he had been in incredible pain due to an excess of magic. However, when this squirrel came, he immediately felt better. Therefore, the guy assumed that it was most likely the same calming power of the divine beast that affected him. He sat and thought about how this magical animal belonged to Tayson, but he thought that he would take it for himself, because it made him feel much better. When the next morning came, the squirrel was already safely lying in her small bed and resting after her night's adventure. Meanwhile, Tayson picked up some books and decided to read a little about the divine beasts. It was written there that they have the potential to take human forms, so human names are used for them. For example, when referring to gender, instead of female or male, they are called a woman or simply a man. When the guy read about this, he was surprised, because in the end, it is still an animal. So he didn't understand why they weren't called the same as animals when it came to their gender. The book also said that the gender of a divine beast can be determined by the shape of its tail. So Tayson, without thinking twice, asked, "Is this really so?" And grabbing the squirrel by the tail, he told her to let him touch her tail. The girl, of course, was shocked that he grabbed her tail so hard, thereby waking her up. She also did not understand why he suddenly started behaving like that, because it was completely unlike him. Never before had she seen him read books and study something new. But after that, she noticed that her tail was about to fall off, so she began waving her paws in the air so that he would pay attention and finally let her go. However, the guy did not pay any attention to her. He looked at the book again and realized that, judging by the picture, she was female. But then, he suddenly remembered that such animals are usually called women, so he corrected himself. As soon as she heard about this, she immediately calmed down and wondered, is this really true? After all, she was completely stunned when she heard this information. After that, Tayson looked at her with some irritation in his eyes and asked, "Does this really mean that she will later turn into a girl?" And he was also interested in how old she was in general. The squirrel continued to be angry because of how narrow-minded and even stupid he was, because she absolutely could not know this information, because she had only recently reincarnated. And even if she had known, then of course she would not have been able to convey it to him. But soon he finally let her go back to the table and said that he really hoped that she was older than him. After all, it would be easier to make her do something. He also said that if she was too young, she wouldn't be able to understand what he was saying to her, and it just irritated him, so he still hoped for the best. When the squirrel was back on the table, she looked at him with the sternest gaze and couldn't understand if he was really serious about all this. She also decided that once she became human, her connection with him would be severed, so he wouldn't have to think and worry about these things. After that, the guy went back to studying the book, and she went back to the nut that was lying next to her. In fact, she wanted to ask Johan to remove the Highland sign and leave this terrible place immediately after she turned into a human. As soon as she remembered this very nice guy, her soul felt warm, because he was such a sweet and rather straightforward child that at some point she even wanted to just drop everything and hug him. She also wanted to help him more than anything in the world, and he did not refuse her request. So she decided that as soon as she became human, everything would fall into place, and she would no longer have to worry about any little things. The girl was ready to burst into tears, because she could not understand how she could turn into a human at all, because she considered it practically unrealistic in her circumstances. The squirrel also didn't know how long she would have to survive like this, eating only nuts. She had already begun to dislike them very much, you see. She had overeaten, being a squirrel. Of course, she didn't know the exact conditions and how she could become human, but if she continued to absorb Johan's magic, then perhaps she could find the answer. So throwing the nuts aside, she lay down on her pillow again and tried to fall asleep, but she just couldn't, because various sad thoughts were creeping into her head. She really wanted to become a human already, but unfortunately there was no such magical method, so she just had to accept it and endure it. When night fell, she, as promised, had already gone to Johan, and in the meantime he was sitting near the open window. The guy looked closely at the nut she had brought him last night, and thought that he wasn't sure if the squirrel would come this time. After all, it could have been just a hallucination due to severe pain. He might actually believe it if he didn't have physical proof in the form of the nut. So he thought that he should have acted a little weaker back then, so that she would understand what a terrible situation he was in and would definitely come back. However, despite all his sad thoughts, he suddenly saw a small paw that had caught on his window parapet. And after that, a cute little girl's face appeared, who finally climbed up to him and waved happily. When Johan saw her, he simply blossomed with happiness. After greeting the divine being, he said that he was very glad to see her again. He also replied that he was incredibly happy that she actually came that day, and also admitted that he had already begun to doubt that she would do it. The girl, meanwhile, waved her paw at him again and mentally said hello. She thought that he was a real cutie and that he looked incredibly handsome again that day, so of course she came to him. Then he held out his hands, and she jumped into them, hearing the question that came from Johan. He wanted to know if it was dangerous for her to come to him. Before he could wait for her answer, the guy also said that it must have been hard for her to climb over all those hard walls when she climbed the tower. Meanwhile, Johan stepped back a little and pointed towards his bed, telling her to sit there for a while and rest, since the journey was still very long. The squirrel immediately jumped there and looked at him with an admiring look, and Johan said that he wanted her to be as comfortable as possible. However, the only suitable place for this was his bed. She didn't understand how a person could be so kind. After all, when she was with Tazen, she had already forgotten that such people even existed. After that, she pointed to the empty seat next to her, hinting that he should lie down next to her, and in return, she was going to provide him with first-class service, pain relief. The guy immediately understood what she meant, but was a little worried and asked if he really needed to lie down too. But he replied that he was actually fine and that it was not at all necessary. However, the squirrel continued to insist on her own. She showed all her displeasure with a rude expression on her face. Of course, she thought that the patient should be above all else, so she wanted him to lie down quickly, and they had already started the procedures. Soon the guy finally agreed, and seeing her menacing expression, laughed, saying that he would lie down, and also added that she was incredibly kind, since she asked him to do this. After he lay down on the pillow, the squirrel took him a little higher and touched his forehead. Thereby he immediately began to feel a surge of energy and a retreat of the pain that had recently been unbearable. They were like this in silence for a while. After that, Johan blushed a little and said that he wanted to repay her for the acorn she gave him, so he made up a special name for her so that he could somehow address her. The guy also asked her if she wanted to hear his name. As soon as the girl found out that he wanted to give her a name, she was surprised, because she hadn't even thought about the fact that she didn't have one until that moment. Tizan continued to call her slave every day, and it really drove her crazy. But now this sweet entity only says sweet words to her, so she wanted to hear the name he would give her. Then suddenly Johan asked if this meant that she was giving him permission. She immediately shook her head, and then the guy, smiling, asked what she thought about the floor. When the squirrel heard this male name, she immediately got angry. She tried to tell him with her whole appearance that this was simply a disgusting choice for her. She managed to convey all her emotions so well that Johan felt incredibly ashamed and asked if she didn't like it. Then he asked her what she thought about Tom or Kelborn, then maybe Dave, but she categorically rejected all these options. After thinking for a while, Johan sighed heavily and said that he didn't know what to do, since she didn't like any of these names, and he couldn't think of any more. As soon as she heard this and looked at his beautiful expression, she immediately felt sorry for him. She decided to forgive him for this oversight only because he had an incredibly cute face, but next time she would like him to come up with a more suitable name for her. As if reading her thoughts, Johan sighed heavily and said that he would still come up with a few more options. She continued to hold his forehead, and thought about how it had been some time since they had started to stabilize his condition. But his magic continued to flow, as if it was endless. She thought that perhaps it was because she had already experienced it once and was absorbing much more than she had the previous day. In fact, at some point she even thought that if she continued, this energy would be filled in her, and perhaps something bad would happen. So she finally took her paw away from him because she couldn't continue to suck in that energy. So she decided to stop for the day. And when she suddenly looked at the guy, she saw that he didn't even notice that she had removed her hand because he had fallen into a peaceful sleep. The squirrel immediately exhaled with relief and thought about how she had managed to make another successful magic absorption for Johan. However, at that moment she felt something strange. What was happening inside her? Her body suddenly began to glow, and she did not understand why energy filled her even after she stopped touching the guy. But at that moment, she suddenly felt how, instead of her small body, completely different parts began to appear. The girl immediately realized that she was turning into a human and simply could not believe it. Johan felt something strange at that moment. He saw a bright light, so he woke up immediately, and when he sat up in bed, he was so surprised that he couldn't even say a word. And all because right in front of him, instead of that little squirrel that was absorbing his excess energy, a beautiful young lady appeared. She managed to cover herself with a sheet in time so that nothing extra could be seen because she was completely naked. Johan asked in a trembling voice who she was and what she was doing in his bed. Then the girl tried to say something and suddenly realized that now that she was in a human body, she could finally say something. This, of course, made her very happy. At that moment, she finally realized that she was now truly a human being. And she looked at her hands in great surprise, since she had not seen them for a very long time. She thought it was just adorable and wonderful. And she also realized that her voice sounded so young and her hands were so tiny, which meant that she was not very old. At that moment, Johan took even more of the blanket and threw it completely over her shoulders so that she would not accidentally show him anything extra. The guy felt incredibly awkward about the whole situation. His face turned red, and he asked her to cover her whole body first, and then they could talk. The girl smiled and thanked him. In fact, she herself felt very awkward, but after that she asked, "Is it true that you are probably incredibly shocked?" Johan, turning away from her, lowered his head and only asked in a surprised voice, "What's going on?" Then the girl smiled and said, "In fact, divine beasts can sometimes turn into humans." However, just as she was about to say something else, all the magic seemed to evaporate, and she instantly turned back into a squirrel. Once she realized this, she was incredibly surprised and very upset that her life in a human body had lasted so short. When she returned the next day, Tezon was also reading a book. He said that divine beasts who absorbed a large amount of mana in a short time could temporarily turn into humans. However, this is only a temporary phenomenon. In order to achieve a complete transformation, they must continuously absorb mana for 50 days. Only then is there a chance that they can permanently turn into a human. Tezon also read that if they turn into a human before this deadline, then all the accumulated mana will be exhausted and reset. As soon as the girl heard these words, she was incredibly indignant. She thought that he should have read her this information much earlier, because she had already experienced the transformation into a human, and now everything was reset. Tezon was a little surprised by the information he read, and said that it really irritated him. He looked at the squirrel and asked, "Is it really going to take 50 days?" Of course, she didn't answer him, and the guy told her to keep a close eye on the dates from now on. After all, if they had to wait that long, they simply had no choice. He turned the book towards her, and she looked into it, thinking that now she would like to know how to properly absorb mana stably, so as not to suddenly turn into a human and reset everything again. The guy, as if he had read her thoughts, began to read on. It was written that when a divine beast feels that it has absorbed too much mana, it cannot stop and continue to absorb in order to conserve the mana it has taken in. When the squirrel heard about this, she concluded that yesterday she just needed to continue absorbing mana without letting go of Johan. She decided that it was very good and understood everything. And so next time she will definitely do it the right way, so as not to break the rules again. But then suddenly, after a short silence, Pizan again called her a slave and said that in fact she was incredibly lucky. He explained these words by saying that it was rare to find a magician who could turn a divine beast into a human, and this rare magician somehow magically became her master. Of course, when the girl heard all this, she got angry, but she didn't react in any way. She just went to her feeding trough and thought that she still had to do all this for another 50 days. If she continued to absorb Johan's mana for all these days, she would eventually be able to truly become human. And now she was completely sure of it, since she had already reincarnated into him once, albeit for a short time. She took the seed and began to chew it thoughtfully, thinking that Johan should also know this information in order to facilitate their cooperation. So she also thought about how she could convey all this to him. But at that moment, she looked at the book that her owner was holding in his hands and realized that this would be a good decision. So that same evening, she went to Johan again. Only this time, the girl took a page from this book with her so that Johan could read it. As soon as the guy accepted the squirrel into his room, he was very surprised and asked what it was, but he quickly took the piece of paper and began to unroll it, thinking that it was some kind of letter. But as soon as he unfolded it, he immediately realized that it was a page from a book. But then he looked at the squirrel and asked why she gave it to him at all. The girl didn't answer this, but only shook her head. She thought that this was necessary for their mutual communication and to make their work easier, so he should read it. As soon as she pointed her paw at him, the guy smiled and thought that she was trying to tell him something. But of course, he didn't understand anything. After a while of silence, Johan turned to her and asked if it was true that she was a divine beast. She said that this was all exactly so. Then she began to explain further, showing that she had read the book and the guy understood it. But then suddenly she pointed her paw at her sign in the middle of her chest, and he immediately guessed that it was Tazen, having read the book. Once she explained all the details and subtleties, he unfolded the piece of paper again and asked if this meant that he also had to study the divine beasts from this guy's book. She immediately became happy, jumped on his shoulder, and thought that, just as she expected, he was very smart, so he was able to understand body language well. As soon as she started jumping up on his shoulder, Johan became a little wary and asked what was going on. But she patted him on the cheek, thereby implying that he was doing a good job. The guy laughed and said that he thanked her for that. After that, he went back to reading the same page that the squirrel had brought him. When he finished reading, he turned to her and asked, "Did this mean that if she absorbed his mana for 50 days, she could actually become human forever?" The squirrel immediately sat on his shoulder and nodded her head in agreement. He then smiled and thought that in this case, after these days, he would be able to see again that beautiful girl who appeared before him last night. He whispered that it was incredibly cute, but the squirrel didn't hear and immediately asked what he was saying. The guy got embarrassed and replied that nothing like that happened. Of course, he didn't understand what she was asking him, but he decided to play it safe. After a long silence, Johan looked at the piece of paper again and actually began to hope that he would be able to see this beautiful girl again. The next morning, when Tazen sat down to read his book again, he discovered that several pages had been torn out. He immediately began to scream, not understanding what had happened to his dear textbook. Meanwhile, the squirrel just lay there and slept, paying no attention to him at all. He pointed his finger in her direction and turned to her, calling her a slave again, asking if she knew anything about what had happened to his book. The girl at that moment thought that, of course, it was completely useless to ask her about anything, because even if he asked her for the 100th time, she would not be able to answer either, because she was just an animal. The guy immediately got up from his seat and went to the bookcase where all his expensive books were kept. He did not understand what was happening and even assumed that his mother had gone crazy while he was sleeping. He began to search everywhere for torn pages and, sighing heavily, thought that life with such power was incredibly difficult. It irritated him that now he couldn't even sleep peacefully at night. The wind of his power was getting out of control and doing whatever it wanted. When he still couldn't find the page, no matter how hard he tried, he sighed heavily, stopped, and thought that he couldn't even imagine how far she had to have flown, so that he couldn't find her now. Meanwhile, the squirrel continued to lie on her bed and thought that she had heard this nonsense so often that now it even calmed her down. It was easier for her to fall asleep to these sounds. After some time, the guy suddenly noticed that it was raining heavily outside. He was immediately happy about it. Quite quickly, Tezen grabbed his squirrel by the body and told her that she needed to stop sleeping and quickly go and look at this rain. He led her to the window and said that he would like to show her something very interesting. The squirrel was very angry with him. She did not understand why this guy was so excited about the rain, even assumed that he was some kind of worm that crawls out after the storm begins. But he held her small body so tightly that she couldn't even move. She also concluded that this would most likely not be good, because everything this guy liked was terrible. And then suddenly, when the girl looked more closely at the window, she saw poor Johan there, who was walking along the cold, wet streets without even an umbrella. Tezen, meanwhile, smiling happily, told her to look there, and also explained that on rainy days the patient could finally begin his walk. She, of course, was incredibly outraged by such inappropriate behavior and wanted to help Johan, but she couldn't. The guy at this point, continuing to smile, said that it was incredibly funny. The head doctor says that it is very good for him to walk wet in the rain, thereby taking a walk. Then he suddenly laughed and said that since he had a high temperature, in his opinion this was just the perfect treatment, because the rain was cold and would cool him down. When the squirrel heard this, she became even more angry and did not understand how this could be good at all. She watched the poor child suffer from his magic, and they even forced him to follow such charlatanism. She thought that everyone was crazy, since they allowed this to happen to poor Johan. She wondered what she should do to help him, because his complexion looked very bad, and she knew that he was not feeling any better. She understood that if they left him in this state, his health would only get worse, so she had to take some measures. Well, at that moment, Tezen suddenly threw it back on the table and said that he wanted to go and help cure his poor brother. Of course, he didn't mean it with good intentions. Squirrel understood this perfectly. He was just going to make fun of him even more. So she was going to run after Tezen, but then suddenly stopped. She looked at her food and thought that since Tezen was gone, the torment would only get worse for Johan. She knew she had to help him immediately, so at that moment she began to take some nuts to carry with her. She, of course, didn't know how many nuts she would need, so she decided to take as many with her as she could. The girl even stuffed a few into her mouth to bring as many as possible. After that, she was able to open her window and thought that Johan needed to wait a little longer because she was already on her way to save him. Elsa, meanwhile, was in her office. As soon as it started raining, she immediately went to the window and began to watch. Her husband came to see her there, and she said that no matter how she felt about Johan, she still felt that he was in a better state than usual. So, frowning, she asked, "Does this mean that the treatment is effective?" The man bowed, asked her for forgiveness, and said that indeed his condition had improved slightly over the past few days. However, this did not mean that the treatment was working. He explained that hypothermia was a special remedy for wizards, and since it would rain until evening that day, his treatment could be extended. If that happened, he would most likely return to his original state. Elsa, folding her arms across her chest, said that it was true. He was an excellent doctor, and she believed that he would be able to continue to take good care of Johan. She also said that after that he could leave. The man bowed again and told the lady that he was about to leave. At that moment, she herself was thinking about Johan, who was a real thorn in her side. When she first learned that this guy was born with magical abilities, her blood literally ran cold in her stomach. She even thought about getting rid of him immediately after birth, because she knew that he would cause her a lot of trouble and inconvenience. Elsa kept him alive for many years only to prevent any scandal that would be associated with the death of the Duke heir. And now, because of this terrible military oath, she unfortunately cannot just go and eliminate him, and this girl was very irritated by this. In fact, the military oath is a very important document, because the long war weakened the imperial power. It was a countermeasure by the emperor, who feared that the influence of the nobility would increase in response. And the head of the noble family had to participate in the battlefield. And if they fell in battle, then their place had to be taken by a family member from the same house. That's why Elsa can't send Thason to such a terrible place. So she had no choice but to keep Johan alive as a replacement until the end of the war. Therefore, it was only in this sense that she was grateful to him for the fact that she could cling, thanks to this, to the insignificant life that he had. At that very moment, Johan simply could not walk. He stopped, and the maids pulled him by the arms so that he would continue on his way. He asked them to slow down a little, because it was really hard for him. But of course they didn't listen. One of the maids said that there was still a very long way to go, so if they slowed down too much, it would be unpleasant even for him. So she asked him to be more careful in following the doctor's orders, no matter how much he didn't want to. So the guy had no choice but to obey them and, through severe pain, continue walking at a fairly fast pace. The squirrel, meanwhile, had already managed to reach the tree, which was nearby, and observing all this, she thought that now that she was close, the situation seemed even worse to her than it had been before. Watching Johan, she saw how much pain he was experiencing. However, no one showed the slightest sympathy towards him. So she decided to take the initiative into her own hands. The girl placed the nuts next to her and decided to make the right choice. She aimed one of the nuts straight at the maid. In fact, in the original story, Johan didn't have any allies at all. However, since the girl was there, she was going to fight with him to prevent the guy from becoming a villain. So she threw nut after nut at the maids, and they fell to the ground because they felt a strong pain in their eyes because the girl threw them right there. Johan at that moment looked at them in great surprise and did not understand what had happened. But when he looked down and saw a nut there, he immediately guessed what had happened. The guy picked it up and immediately started looking around in search of his favorite squirrel, because he knew perfectly well that it was her doing. And soon, not far from him, he finally saw her sitting on a tree. She, meanwhile, was waving to him, hinting that he should hurry up and come to her. Johan looked around and thought that this really was the perfect time to escape. Therefore, without thinking twice, he ran towards the squirrel, who was sitting nearby. The maids, meanwhile, had already managed to open their eyes, and turning to the young master, were talking about him coming back, and also about the fact that he couldn't leave like that. The guy, meanwhile, had already managed to run into the estate and slammed the door behind him. When the squirrel saw this, she was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. She thought that it was just a great hit on her part, and also realized that she didn't even expect that she could do it so well. So she assumed that maybe she had some talent for it. She stayed in the tree for a while longer and thought that Johan had already safely returned to the tower, so she suggested that she should go there too. However, at that moment, she heard a very familiar voice. This guy started shouting loudly, approaching the maids, so the squirrel immediately looked in the same direction. Of course, that man was Tezon. He said he had gone through all the trouble of bringing water to this place, and they had somehow missed Johan. The maids were all shaking with fear. They both lowered their heads, and one of them said that the matter was that she had been slightly distracted, and in the meantime the guy had managed to return to his tower. Tezon then became even more angry. His hand even began to shake, and then he began to shout at them, saying that he did not understand why the hell they allowed themselves to let him go. And at that very second, he poured ice water straight onto those maids. He continued to swear and shout at them, but then suddenly his mother came up behind him and told him to stop. When the guy turned around, he saw her, and said that this was an incredibly rare opportunity for him to bully Johan. However, it was ruined because of these two idiots. But Elsa put her hand on his shoulder and said that there was nothing to worry about. So she asked him to take his mind off these thoughts and asked if it was true that he wanted to help his brother with his treatment. Tezon, hearing this, was at first a little surprised, but then said that everything was exactly like this. He wanted to help his brother with the treatment even more, but these maids simply missed him. Elsa then sighed, said that she understood everything, but there was no need to be so upset that he couldn't see his brother that day. She also added that when a special guest came to visit them the next day, she would ask him to call Johan. The woman asked if it would not be more pleasant to meet the guest the next day together with her brother, for she thought that it would be much better. The boy, hearing this, was immediately glad and asked if she was talking about the Duchess Madicest and the young lady. Mother, hearing this, immediately nodded her head in agreement with a smile on her face, and the squirrel, when she heard about this, immediately understood that this was the main character of the novel. She was incredibly surprised and even scared by the fact that Johan would meet the heroine so quickly. She began to panic and knew that according to the original story, Johan and Mary were not supposed to meet until the war was over. Therefore, she even assumed that most likely this would happen because she helped Johan that day, and therefore all the events of the novel changed a little. The squirrel also understood perfectly well that this whole horrible family was planning to humiliate the poor guy even more tomorrow because he had ruined their plans for that day. Squirrel knew that they would put him on display, comparing him to Tizon, and thus simply disgrace him completely. She understood that it was truly terrible and cruel. But at that moment Elsa came even closer to her son and said that tomorrow he should show his magical talents. She also offered to take his divine beast with him in order to show these beautiful ladies how powerful he is. When the squirrel heard about this, she was so surprised that she was ready to scream in fear. She did not understand. Did they really want to take her along with them to this terrible and cruel event? Several hours passed from that moment, and when night fell, Johan approached the window with difficulty, but was still able to open it so that if anything happened, the squirrel could run in calmly. Immediately after this, the guy wrapped himself around a small counter that was next to the window and, breathing heavily, sat there for a while. He really felt incredibly awful and assumed that it was probably because he had been caught in the heavy rain. He immediately thought that the squirrel would make him feel better, so he just needed to wait a little longer until it came. After this, Johan looked at his hand, in which he held the nut, and thought that he would like to use it for one thing. He believed that if he could stabilize his magic with the help of this divine beast and use spells again, he would finally be able to destroy this most terrifying duchy that had irritated him all his life. So when he realized that this squirrel needed his magic in order to be able to turn into a human, he really felt a great relief. And all because, as long as their interests coincide, this squirrel will return to him all the time, because it had its own benefit in this communication. That's why he convinced himself that the squirrel and he were just using each other to get what they wanted. And that was exactly what he told himself day in and day out. However, that day when she came to his aid, she made the guy think, was this really his strategy, since she was not at all obliged to do this? At that moment, the squirrel had already managed to run up to him and jumped onto Johan's shoulder. He immediately smiled and said that he was very glad that she had come after all. He also wanted to talk about what had happened earlier, and so he thanked her from the bottom of his heart for the help she had given him during the day. As he stood up, he said that he was incredibly grateful to her, because he had gotten less wet in the rain this way, and therefore his body felt better than it could have. The squirrel itself at that moment began to squeak something, as if trying to convey something to him, and grabbed his shirt so that he would not get up, but would sit for a while longer until she tried to relieve his pain. But he glanced at her and said that everything was actually fine, then closed his eyes and she still touched him, taking away the excess magical energy. And Johan still didn't know whether he should trust her at all, because this is the first time in his life when he can talk to at least someone, and now he is no longer alone. At least every evening this squirrel comes to him, who helps. Several hours had passed since then. Johan had already managed to move back to the bed, and by the end of their procedure he had already fallen asleep. The girl sat next to him on the bed and thought that his magic had calmed down. However, the fever from the heavy rain still remained. As if being sick from his magical powers wasn't bad enough, he now has to add extra pain and suffering. And besides, it was incredibly hard for her to think about the fact that tomorrow he would also be humiliated in front of everyone else. Exposing Johan in such a state in front of others is essentially an announcement that he, the eldest son of Highland, cannot inherit anything. And as always, everything goes exactly as Elsa wants it. Thanks to the fact that Johan is in terrible health, Thiessen will receive even more support from other people, and this will put him in the right light. Sighing heavily, the squirrel shook her head and thought about how tomorrow she would have to do this again and see it all in person. It was hard for her to even think about how this catastrophe would develop. But the fact that she would have to be present from start to finish depressed her even more. She thought about this Tezin, that guy who always irritated her. However, today he was simply unbearable. She really barely survived until the evening to escape. Every action of this boy irritated her, and what surprised the squirrel most was the fact that he even put a mask on his face in order to make a good impression on Mary. But of course, she believed that this would not save him at all, because no one canceled his bad character. Squirrel thought that maybe she should leave dirty marks on his face while he slept at night. Maybe that would improve the situation a little. She enjoyed thinking about how angry he would be when he woke up and saw dirty marks on his face. She even thought that, because his face was so smooth now, the marks would stand out even more. Squirrel was incredibly happy that she had come up with such a plan, so she decided that it was time for her to go back and leave those marks on his face. But just as she was about to run to the window, she suddenly heard Johan's voice behind her. He asked very sadly, "Does she really have to leave already?" The guy also said, almost crying, that she hadn't visited him for a long time, so he thought that she would stay with him a little longer. Squirrel stopped immediately. She couldn't believe that this guy was so cute that she couldn't even resist refusing him. She thought that there was nothing she could do in this situation. She ran closer to him and understood that tomorrow would be a hard day for him, so she should at least calm him down a little before she had to go and leave him alone. When she came up to his hands, she tapped them with her little paws. The guy immediately guessed that she probably wanted him to open them and asked, "Is this true?" The squirrel immediately nodded its head. When he did, it lay on its back in his arms and began to smile happily. It looked like such an incredibly cute creature that you immediately wanted to cuddle it. He was a little surprised and immediately asked what this should mean for him, because he really didn't understand. But she, meanwhile, pointed to her belly with her little paw, not understanding what he was waiting for. You see, if he starts stroking her little belly, he will immediately feel better, because it always works. He immediately realized that she probably wanted him to do this, and then he began to stroke her fur with one finger. She really was incredibly warm and pleasant. So Johan told her about it and thanked her for letting him do it. The girl herself lay there and understood that for her it was also quite a pleasant feeling, so she also benefited from this situation. Then suddenly his voice became very serious and even angry. He called her his squirrel and said that he wanted her to always stay by his side. It sounded really ominous, but the girl didn't pay attention to it because she was very pleased with his touch on her soft belly. In fact, when divine beasts calm down wizards, the wizards develop a strong sense of ownership over that very beast. And in extreme cases, they can't even see their animal with another magician. He becomes incredibly jealous and can therefore even harm the animals. Some time passed from that moment, and finally the morning came. Squirrel managed to return home on time because she was woken up early. She was not happy at all. The poor girl in the form of a squirrel was placed in Tizan's arms, and they even put a bow on her neck to make her look more beautiful. The guy was also dressed very smartly, and they were already heading to the guest room to greet their guests. The girl was also not very happy about this whole event. Not only because Johan would be humiliated there, but also because her servants had taken away every part of her body since the morning and spent a very long time washing it. Walking further and further, the guy asked if she was now ready to begin their performance, and entering inside, he apologized for being late to all the people who were already present in the banquet hall. He said he was simply delayed by his divine beast's calming ritual. He explained to his guests that the magic in his body had given him a headache, so he needed to rest a bit before their meeting. Squirrel, meanwhile, looked at him skeptically and thought that this was, of course, a lie. And it always came from there when he opened his mouth to say anything at all. But then suddenly she felt like something was starting to blind her, and she couldn't understand where this light was coming from. And when she turned her head towards the people sitting at the table, she immediately realized that it was all because of Mary, because she was simply stunning. The girl came to the conclusion that she really was the most beautiful woman in the world that had ever existed. Squirrel even became curious about what Johan's reaction to her would be, because she really is beautiful. And now she understood why he fell in love with her at first sight in the original story. However, the moment she looked at Johan, she noticed that he was not as cheerful and enthusiastic as he should be. So she wondered what had happened. The girl also did not understand why he was looking at her with such a strange look. This made her very wary and worried. But all this awkward silence was broken by Mary, who, having heard about the divine being, said that this was the first time she had seen something like this. The lovely girl explained that she had heard that there were very few of them, so it was very difficult to find even one. Her mother smiled awkwardly and said that having enough magical power to require a divine beast was admirable. Tezen, meanwhile, came up and sat down at the table, and the woman said that this guy looked incredibly like the Duke of Highland. The boy immediately smiled happily and said that he was still far from being comparable to his father, but he was really very happy to hear these words. He also added that without his divine beast, he would have had a very hard time. At that moment, the squirrel looked at him with great contempt and thought that if he had been raised as a swindler, he would have achieved great success in the world, because what he knows best is how to deceive and fool people. At this point, Mary began to smile happily and asked how, in that case, one could calm the divine beast. She explained that she had heard that it could be done through a special contact, and also wondered if it was different for each divine beast. She thought that it happened differently for everyone.